May 1945. Southern Okinawa lies shattered beneath a gray, drifting haze. The evening wind pushes smoke across the ridgeline, carrying the sharp smell of cordite and burnt earth. The battle has been raging for hours, leaving the coral slopes torn open, trees splintered, and bodies, American and Japanese, scattered between the rocks. In a shallow trench carved into the hillside, a group of Japanese officers watch silently as dusk settles over the broken landscape. Their uniforms are caked with dust, their faces hollow from days without proper rest. They expect the Americans to push forward with rifles ready, finishing off the wounded as the fighting finally subsides. But what they witness is something entirely different. Across the slope, American medics move deliberately between the fallen, checking pulses, bandaging wounds, lifting the injured onto stretchers. They do not distinguish between uniforms. A Japanese corporal, barely conscious, is carried by 2 U.S. Marines who moments earlier had fought through the same ridge. The officers stare in disbelief. This was not the enemy they had been told to expect, not the merciless invaders described in the leaflets and speeches. And a question forming silently in their minds would follow them long after the battle ended. Why was America fighting them with humanity instead of hatred? To understand why those Japanese officers on Okinawa were so shocked, we must go back to a world that spiraled toward total war. A world where 2 nations, so different in culture, doctrine, and worldview, raced toward a confrontation neither fully understood. In the early 20th century, the United States and Imperial Japan were not natural enemies. They traded, negotiated, and even respected one another's rise on the global stage. But beneath the surface, the Pacific was becoming too small for 2 expanding powers. Japan's militaristic leadership embraced an ideology rooted in Bushido and national destiny, believing the empire must dominate Asia or be consumed by Western pressure. America, meanwhile, held a very different worldview, one shaped by democratic institutions, evolving international law, and the belief, at least officially, that nations could coexist without conquest. Throughout the 1930s, the gap widened. Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, its brutal expansion into China in 1937, and its growing alliance with Nazi Germany painted a darker future. While American newspapers published images of the Nanjing atrocities, Tokyo's leaders warned their people that the West sought to strangle Japan's rightful ascent. Propaganda hardened both societies, but in Japan it became a total ideology. Americans were portrayed as decadent, lazy, and morally rotten, incapable of honorable combat. Officers and soldiers were taught that Westerners feared close combat and lacked the spiritual courage to withstand Japan's warrior spirit. This narrative made the strike at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, more than a military blow. It was a test of identity. For the United States, the attack ignited a surge of fury. Cities mobilized overnight. Men lined up at recruiting stations in numbers that stunned Washington. Newspapers demanded vengeance. Across living rooms and factories, the same feeling spread. America had been struck without warning, and the war would be fought to its end. From Tokyo's perspective, the attack proved what they believed all along, that Americans were soft and would crumble once shocked. Japanese officers confidently predicted the U.S. public would lose its will before a single year had passed. They misread the country entirely. Yet beneath American anger, something else took shape. President Franklin D. Roosevelt insisted the war must still follow rules. Commanders were reminded that brutality, even when tempting, would backfire strategically and morally. The United States was imperfect. Racism existed, and hatred often surged in the field, but the core doctrine emphasized professionalism over vengeance. Soldiers were trained to fight fiercely, but not sadistically. They were taught discipline, not bloodlust. This contrast would not be clear until the armies finally met on Pacific Islands. The first clashes revealed just how different the two sides were. At Bataan, U.S. troops fought in collapsing conditions until forced to surrender. In the aftermath, thousands died on the infamous Bataan Death March. Survivors later described Japanese guards beating, bayoneting, and shooting prisoners who collapsed. The brutality shocked America and deepened rage on the home front. In the Japanese military mind, however, surrender itself was shameful. Under Bushido, a warrior who laid down his arms forfeited honor and often the right to live. Japanese troops believed they were treating prisoners as cowards deserved. The concept that the enemy should still receive medical treatment and humane care after capture was alien to them. Meanwhile, American doctrine, shaped by the Geneva Conventions and decades of military tradition, demanded lawful treatment of POWs whenever possible. Even early in the war, when emotions were raw, American commanders warned their troops against unlawful executions. Reports of misconduct were investigated. Offenders could face court-martial. The message was clear: discipline defined the U.S. military, not hatred. This philosophical divide deepened with each island campaign. On Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Japanese soldiers fought to the death, refusing surrender even when surrounded. American troops, encountering an enemy that rarely yielded and often feigned surrender to launch suicide attacks, developed a hardened skepticism. Yet command still emphasized restraint when real surrenders occurred. When Japanese captives were taken alive, they were typically fed, clothed, and questioned, not abused. These experiences created confusion among Japanese officers. Their own training held that Americans would kill prisoners without hesitation. Yet early accounts from surviving Japanese POWs described medical treatment, respect, and even attempts at communication. Tokyo's propaganda machine branded these stories as lies. Officers were told such captives were contaminated by enemy kindness. But the truth was beginning to spread quietly, through whispers in trenches and handwritten diaries carried close to the chest. The Americans fought brutally, but not needlessly. They killed in battle, but not after it. They followed rules even when doing so slowed them down or endangered them. These contradictions would only sharpen as the war intensified, and they would reach their breaking point on the ridges, caves, and shattered hillsides of Okinawa, where Japanese officers first saw, with their own eyes, that the enemy they hated was choosing a different path. As the Pacific War expanded, the contrast between American and Japanese military culture grew even sharper. The two forces were not simply fighting with different weapons or tactics. They were fighting from entirely different moral universes. By 1943, the United States had reshaped itself into a wartime machine. Millions of men were in uniform, and the nation's industrial output dwarfed anything Japan could match. But alongside the steel, fuel, and ammunition, Washington invested heavily in military doctrine, how its soldiers were expected to behave. Manuals emphasized discipline, chain of command, and the lawful treatment of prisoners. Senior leaders believed that military power without moral restraint would corrode the very values America claimed to defend. This mindset didn't always hold on the battlefield. War is too chaotic for absolutes, but formed the backbone of U.S. policy. American troops were repeatedly reminded, fight fiercely, but do not become what you are fighting. Japan's approach could not have been more different. The Imperial Army had evolved from samurai traditions into an uncompromising institution where the concept of surrender was nearly erased from doctrine. Officers drilled into young soldiers the idea that defeat was worse than death. The Code of Bushido was reshaped into a state ideology, teaching that loyalty to the emperor must be absolute and that prisoners, both taken and surrendered, were symbols of shame. This belief shaped everything. Japanese units often fought until annihilated, refusing to lay down their arms even when surrounded. Many wounded soldiers carried grenades solely to kill themselves rather than be captured. Civilians on islands like Saipan and Okinawa were warned that Americans would torture them, pushing thousands to jump from cliffs when Japanese defense collapsed. Propaganda reinforced a worldview in which Americans were monstrous and dishonorable, unworthy of trust, incapable of mercy. In Japanese barracks, officers described American soldiers as undisciplined, materialistic, and reliant on machines rather than spirit. The idea that such an enemy would risk their own lives to treat a wounded Japanese soldier was unthinkable. To them, mercy toward the enemy was not only unnecessary, it was a sign of weakness. This psychological divide directly shaped battlefield encounters. On islands like Kwajalein, Saipan, and Tinian, U.S. Marines and Army units increasingly faced an enemy who preferred death over capture. When small groups of Japanese soldiers did surrender, the Americans were sometimes uncertain how to handle it. Many young Marines had never seen an enemy willingly give up because it almost never happened. Yet U.S. commanders repeatedly enforced procedures: accept surrenders, search prisoners respectfully, provide medical care, and remove them from the fighting zone. The military police and medical corps were trained specifically for POW management. Even in moments of anger or grief, the institutional push for discipline was constant. Japanese troops noticed. Intercepted diaries, letters, and battlefield testimonies described growing confusion. Some Japanese soldiers admitted shock after receiving water or bandages from Americans, expecting immediate execution. Others noted that prisoners who cooperated were not tortured, but simply questioned and moved to rear camps. Still, most Japanese officers dismissed these reports as enemy trickery. By 1944, as American advances brought them closer to Japan's inner defenses, the psychological contrast became even more profound. U.S. forces encountered civilians for the first time in large numbers, especially in the Marianas. Despite fierce urban combat, American units opened aid stations for wounded civilians and provided food and medicine, behavior wildly inconsistent with the propaganda Tokyo had spread. This contradiction left many Japanese officers deeply unsettled. Their worldview insisted Americans were cruel and vengeful, yet the battlefield increasingly showed otherwise. Each encounter made it harder to maintain the myth of a merciless enemy. And as the war's final year approached, everything converged on a single island, where the largest, bloodiest battle of the Pacific would expose the full contrast between hatred and humanity. Okinawa would become the place where Japanese officers saw, unmistakably, that the Americans were fighting differently than expected. Not softly, not weakly, but with a discipline and restraint that defied everything imperial indoctrination had taught them. On the battlefield, humanity often survives in the most unexpected places. Amid the brutal fighting of the Pacific, where ambushes, close-quarters combat, and fanatical resistance defined the daily experience of American Marines and soldiers, compassion might seem like a luxury no one could afford. Yet again and again, something remarkable occurred. American medics, corpsmen in the Marine Corps, medics in the Army, moved under fire to rescue the wounded, regardless of the uniform they wore. Training taught them to value all life, and many internalized that duty so deeply that they would crawl through machine gun fire to reach someone calling for help, even if it was in broken English or faint Japanese. On Saipan, a wounded Japanese infantryman cried out for water. A Marine corpsman, ignoring warnings that it might be a trap, approached cautiously. Instead of an explosive or a hidden weapon, he found a soldier barely clinging to life. The corpsman bandaged him, carried him to a safe zone, and insisted he be treated like any of ours. Incidents like this were not isolated. They were repeated across dozens of islands. These acts baffled Japanese officers. Their own doctrine taught that the enemy's wounded were simply obstacles. Mercy was seen as wasteful, even dangerous. Many Japanese units had no dedicated medical corps for frontline care, and their soldiers often died without treatment that American troops considered basic. When Japanese POWs reached American aid stations, they were stunned. They received clean bandages. They were given food, real food, not scraps. They were spoken to calmly. Some prisoners later wrote that they were treated like human beings for the first time in war. To American medics, this behavior wasn't heroic, it was expected. To Japanese officers, it was incomprehensible. This human contrast was the first crack in the ideological wall that had been built between the two armies. And it set the stage for the next perspective, the tactical angle, where U.S. commanders had practical reasons for enforcing humane conduct. American restraint during the Pacific War was not only moral, it was strategically intelligent. By 1943, U.S. commanders understood that dead enemies yielded no intelligence, but living prisoners could reveal invaluable information: defensive plans, unit strengths, morale, and supply conditions. Treating Japanese captives well increased the chances that future soldiers might consider surrender, something that could save American lives in the long run. This was especially critical because Japan's no-surrender ethos made every battle extraordinarily costly. If even small groups of Japanese troops dropped their weapons, it reduced the need for dangerous close-quarters assaults. American officers, therefore, pushed their men to accept surrender whenever possible and to treat survivors humanely. It wasn't the human and tactical perspectives only tell part of the story. What happened in the Pacific was shaped not just by battlefield choices, but by logistics, ideology, and the shock experienced by Japanese officers when American conduct contradicted everything they had been taught. To understand their disbelief, we turn to three more angles, each revealing why American humanity appeared so foreign and why it ultimately transformed Japanese perceptions of their enemy. War is often judged by behavior, but behavior is shaped by capability. American treatment of Japanese prisoners and civilians would have been impossible without one critical advantage: logistical dominance. The United States entered the Pacific with unprecedented supply power. Even on distant island chains, U.S. forces could deploy hospital ships, field surgical units, plasma supplies, morphine kits, antiseptics, and train medical personnel. American infantrymen carried more bandages and medical equipment in their packs than some Japanese battalions had in entire companies. This surplus made compassion feasible. When Marines captured wounded Japanese soldiers, they had the resources to treat them without endangering their own wounded. Medical tents could separate patients. Hospital ships offshore could handle major surgeries. Army and Navy corpsmen were taught standardized procedures for wound management and infection control, regardless of a patient's nationality. For Japanese officers raised in an army perpetually short of food, medicine, and transport, this level of care appeared almost unbelievable. Many Japanese units on isolated islands received little more than iodine, a few bandages, and primitive tools. Their medical corps was understaffed and often unable to treat even minor wounds. The idea of expending limited resources on enemy soldiers seemed absurd. Yet Americans did precisely that, again and again. To Japanese observers, this behavior appeared not just humane, but superhuman, as if the U.S. war machine possessed resources beyond comprehension. They were astonished to see American medics stabilizing wounded Japanese prisoners before even treating lightly wounded Americans. In Japanese eyes, this was not just kindness, it was an act from another world. But logistics alone could not explain the shock. For that, we turn to the enemy's emotional and ideological perspective. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Japanese officers were steeped in a very specific view of Americans. They were taught that the United States was morally corrupted, ruled by greed, lacking courage, and incapable of honoring life or death. Propaganda films depicted Americans as racially inferior, emotionally unstable, and prone to cowardice. Even after Pearl Harbor, Japanese newspapers predicted U.S. society would collapse under wartime pressure. These beliefs shaped battlefield expectations. Japanese soldiers sincerely thought Americans would execute captives on sight. Many carried grenades specifically to kill themselves upon capture. Officers warned that surrender meant torture. This psychological conditioning was so strong that even when American troops offered water or shouted promises of safety, Japanese defenders assumed it was a trick. So when the first Japanese POWs returned with stories of humane treatment, medical care, food, even cigarettes, officers dismissed them as traitors or victims of brainwashing. But on islands like Saipan, Tinian, and later Okinawa, officers finally witnessed American behavior firsthand. They saw Marines dragging Japanese wounded out of burning caves. They saw Army medics entering kill zones to rescue enemy soldiers. They saw civilians receiving medical attention, meals, and protection. The shock was profound. Some officers later wrote that the moment they saw Americans treat Japanese casualties with care, the wall of hatred cracked. Others described feeling ashamed that the enemy they were taught to despise showed more mercy to their wounded than their own army could. This ideological collapse would set the stage for another dimension, American leadership, where humanity was not accidental but commanded. American restraint was not random. It stemmed from leadership decisions at multiple levels. Senior commanders understood that moral conduct strengthened discipline, protected prisoners, and upheld international law. It also reinforced the U.S. self-image. America was fighting a brutal war, but refused to become barbaric. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, repeatedly emphasized ethical behavior, even during the most intense operations. General Douglas MacArthur, despite his reputation for ego, issued strict policies on the treatment of civilians and prisoners. Marine Corps leadership drilled the principle that victory came from control, not rage. Medics and corpsmen were given a simple, unwavering mandate. Every wounded person is a patient. This clarity mattered. It meant that even in chaotic firefights, medical personnel had moral grounding stronger than emotion or fear. It meant commanders could expect discipline rather than vengeance. It meant that American conduct, despite flaws and inconsistencies, trended toward restraint. Japanese officers encountering this leadership-driven ethos realized something their propaganda had never prepared them for. The American military was not driven by hatred, but by doctrine, law, and a professional ethos that treated mercy as strength. These angles, human, tactical, logistical, psychological, and ethical, interlocked to reveal a deeper truth about the war. And they all converged toward the moment when Japanese officers finally witnessed the full weight of American humanity amid the horrors of battle. Idealism. It was a calculated strategy for reducing casualties. Furthermore, U.S. leadership recognized another tactical reality. Brutality breeds resistance. If American forces gained a reputation for killing prisoners, it would reinforce Japanese propaganda and guarantee near-total resistance on every island. Maintaining discipline prevented that cycle. Even as combat intensified, General Holland Smith of the Marines drilled into his units. We fight to win, not to slaughter. An enemy who surrenders is no longer your target. The policy worked inconsistently. Fear and rage sometimes overwhelmed discipline. But on the whole, American behavior proved far more controlled than Japanese predictions. Japanese officers encountering this approach were stunned. Their training insisted that mercy was a dangerous weakness, that sparing an enemy was a strategic error. But after several battles, they began to see the opposite. Surrendered soldiers were providing Americans with information that reshaped tactics. Civilians who trusted American troops often revealed cave networks, artillery positions, or Japanese troop movements. Mercy, in American doctrine, wasn't merely noble, it was operationally efficient. 4 Japanese officers steeped in a worldview where compassion had no place in war. This was a deeply unsettling revelation. It suggested that their understanding of warfare itself, not just the enemy, might be flawed. This realization leads naturally into the next dimensions of the story: technology, resources, cultural shock, and leadership. The full meaning of American restraint did not reveal itself in isolated acts of mercy or scattered battlefield encounters. It emerged in one of the most violent, unforgiving confrontations of the entire Pacific War. A battle so vast and destructive that both sides believed it foreshadowed the final struggle for Japan itself. Okinawa, April to June 1945. 100,000 Japanese soldiers entrenched in caverns, tunnels, bunkers, and ridgelines. Civilians trapped between advancing American forces and desperate Japanese commands. Constant rain turning the hills into rivers of mud. Artillery shaking the ground day and night. The smell of smoke and decay drifting across the shattered island. The brutality was beyond anything either side had faced before. Japanese units fought with unwavering resolve. They launched night infiltrations, hidden machine gun ambushes, and last-second grenade attacks. Their positions were carved deep into the limestone, forcing U.S. troops into close-quarters assaults measured in yards, not miles. Every ridge captured revealed another behind it. Every advance left fields of casualties. American forces responded with overwhelming firepower. The Navy's guns pounded ridges until entire hillsides collapsed. Flamethrowers cleared caves. Tanks rolled forward under sheets of rifle fire. The fighting had a rhythm of exhaustion. Advance, dig in, be shelled, advance again. In this environment, hatred seemed inevitable. Many U.S. Marines had lost friends in previous battles where surrender was almost non-existent. Many were hardened by suicide charges and booby-trapped bodies. Japanese officers believed this setting: mud, rain, close combat, constant casualties, would finally strip away American restraint. They expected what their indoctrination had always promised: that when pushed to the breaking point, Americans would reveal themselves as savages. But that breaking point never came. On the southern ridges of the island, Shuri Line, Conical Hill, Sugar Loaf, Madeira Escarpment, the human cost rose so sharply that even seasoned Marines felt the psychological weight. Units lost half their men in a week. Corpsmen carried wounded comrades through sheets of machine gun fire. Japanese counterattacks erupted in the darkness, leaving the ground littered with the dead at sunrise. And still, amid this devastation, American medics continued treating wounded Japanese soldiers. Still, U.S. officers enforced discipline when captives surrendered. Still, American troops escorted civilians to safe zones, offered food, water, and medical care. These actions didn't always halt the fighting. War rarely allows sentiment to overrule survival, but they created moments that Japanese officers could not reconcile with their worldview. One incident in particular became a turning point. On a rain-soaked slope overlooking a shattered village near the Shuri Line, a Japanese company was annihilated during a failed counterattack. As the surviving officers crawled back toward friendly ground, they watched American medics move among the bodies. At first, they assumed the medics were checking for explosives or setting traps. Instead, they were searching for life. A young Marine corpsman found a wounded Japanese sergeant with a chest wound, barely breathing. Without hesitation, he pulled the man toward cover, applied pressure bandages, and called for stretcher bearers. When the Japanese officers saw this, something inside their belief system fractured. They had been told Americans executed wounded enemies. They had been assured no American would risk his life for a Japanese soldier. Yet here it was in the mud before them. Something impossible. Something undeniable. That evening, the officers spoke quietly among themselves, stunned, uncertain, and shaken. The scene contradicted years of propaganda, years of cultural conditioning, years of wartime hatred. For the first time, they saw Americans not as caricatures, but as disciplined professionals bound by a code they could not fully comprehend. This was not the only moment. Similar scenes played out across the island. American medics treating civilians who moments earlier had been used as shields. Marines carrying Japanese children out of caves filled with smoke. U.S. officers trying to negotiate civilian evacuations even under sniper fire. Corpsmen stabilizing wounded Japanese troops before tending to lightly wounded Americans. Navy hospital ships treating Japanese prisoners alongside U.S. soldiers. Each moment added pressure to a worldview already cracking. Yet the true climax of this story would come later, when the Japanese defensive line collapsed and American forces closed in on the final pockets of resistance. It was in those last days, amid total defeat and mounting desperation, that Japanese officers witnessed the full weight of American humanity and realized the war had been built on lies. The collapse of the Shuri Line would push both armies into the final, desperate phase of Okinawa, where the meaning of mercy, discipline, and humanity became impossible to ignore. To the Japanese officers on Okinawa, the Americans' humanity seemed almost impossible to comprehend. For 4 years, imperial propaganda had painted the United States as a decadent, cruel, and collapsing society, too weak-willed to fight, too morally corrupted to endure hardship, too racially divided to stand united in war. Yet the reality confronting them across the battlefield told a very different story. America entered the war with a population larger than Japan, an industrial base unmatched by any Axis power, and a political system built to mobilize rapidly. But its greatest strength was not steel, oil, or factories. It was the paradox at the heart of its character. A nation capable of overwhelming violence, yet guided by an internal moral code that insisted war should be fought with restraint where possible. This paradox shaped everything. The United States could deploy fleets across multiple oceans, level cities with strategic bombing, or land 500,000 men on hostile shores, and yet still issue battlefield instructions ordering medics to treat the wounded of both sides when feasible. Military briefings emphasized that Japanese soldiers, even while fanatically devoted, were ultimately human beings, not monsters to be slaughtered without reason. Such notions were unthinkable inside the Imperial Japanese military structure. Indoctrination taught that mercy toward an enemy was weakness. Compassion risked collapse of willpower. Surrender was dishonor. But in America's political culture, discipline and humanity were not opposites. They were intertwined. A democracy depended on the consent of its citizens, and the U.S. military reflected that philosophy in countless ways. Decentralized initiative, respect for individual life, and the belief that even in war, the nation must remain recognizable to itself. And so, as Japan's leadership hardened its resolve to fight to the last man, America demonstrated something far more destabilizing. Enormous destructive capability combined with a commitment, however imperfect, to the laws of war and the protection of life. This moral contrast would grow more visible with every island taken. And on Okinawa, it was impossible for the surviving Japanese officers to ignore. The final days of Okinawa did not simply mark the end of a battle. They represented the collapse of an entire worldview. Japanese officers, who had been raised to see Americans as cruel, unprincipled, and morally bankrupt, were now forced to confront a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. The battlefield itself had delivered the evidence. Wounded Japanese soldiers being carried to safety, civilians receiving aid, and American medics risking their lives to save enemy combatants. Reports from captured officers reveal the depth of their shock. Lieutenant Colonel Koichi Shibata, captured near Shuri Ridge, wrote in his diary, "I have lived believing Americans are beasts, yet I have seen them carry my men from the mud, bandage their wounds, and give them water. I cannot reconcile this with the image of the enemy I was taught to hate." Such sentiments were not isolated. Across the island, officers of all ranks began to question their indoctrination. Some recorded private admissions of shame at the treatment their own troops had inflicted on civilians compared to the care shown by the Americans. Others expressed confusion over the consistency of U.S. conduct, even in situations where it might have been easier or safer to abandon mercy. The impact of this realization extended beyond individual soldiers. Entire Japanese units were forced to adjust their tactics as surrender became a more conceivable option. The collapse of the Shuri Line, combined with relentless U.S. firepower and the humane treatment of captives, undermined the belief that dying in combat was the only honorable course. Officers who had long dismissed surrender as cowardice now faced the grim truth. Their men were exhausted, surrounded, and being cared for by the very enemy they had been taught to despise. On the American side, leadership closely monitored the treatment of POWs and civilians. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding the U.S. 10th Army, insisted that captured Japanese soldiers be properly processed, fed, and medically treated. His officers reported that this policy not only upheld discipline, but also saved lives by encouraging further surrenders and reducing the ferocity of last-ditch resistance. Even amid horrific casualties, over 12,000 American deaths and tens of thousands wounded, the commitment to humane treatment remained consistent. The psychological effect on Japanese officers was profound. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and existential doubt. Many realized that the enemy they had been conditioned to fear and hate possessed a discipline, moral framework, and humanity that their own society had systematically denied its soldiers. For some, this was a liberating moment. For others, it was a deeply unsettling challenge to everything they had believed about honor, warfare, and the nature of humanity. In these moments, Okinawa became more than a military engagement. It was a crucible for moral reckoning, forcing both Japanese and American soldiers and their officers to confront the meaning of discipline, restraint, and compassion amid the chaos of total war. The lessons of this realization would carry forward into Japan's final days of resistance, setting the stage for the eventual surrender and occupation. As the last Japanese strongholds on Okinawa fell in late June 1945, the full consequences of the battle and the moral contrasts it revealed became impossible to ignore. The Japanese officers who had survived the onslaught were taken prisoner, and many carried with them a profound, often painful awareness. The Americans they had been trained to despise had fought with an unexpected restraint and humanity. Accounts from these prisoners paint a striking picture. Colonel Masahiro Yamada, captured near the northern ridges, recalled being treated with decency during initial interrogation and medical processing. He noted that wounded Japanese soldiers, even those who had recently fought against him, received bandages, food, and water alongside American casualties. Civilian families, often terrorized by combat, were also cared for, and the U.S. forces worked to prevent unnecessary suffering wherever possible. For officers raised in a culture that equated surrender with shame and enemy treatment with suspicion, These actions were revelatory. The cumulative effect of these experiences extended beyond the battlefield. Many Japanese officers later acknowledged that the humane conduct of American forces had contributed to the eventual acceptance of surrender in other parts of the Pacific. It became clear that even in defeat, a disciplined, morally guided adversary could preserve order, honor, and human life, challenging decades of indoctrination. The American occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, reinforced these lessons. Upon assuming control of Japan, MacArthur's administration prioritized rebuilding governance and the humane treatment of civilians and former soldiers alike. Japanese officers witnessed firsthand the stark contrast between the horrors they had fought and the restraint displayed by the occupiers. Policies ensured that Japanese POWs were repatriated safely, cities were stabilized, and reconstruction efforts began under careful, respectful supervision. The psychological and cultural impact was significant. Diaries and post-war interviews show a common thread: a grudging respect, sometimes mingled with disbelief, for the Americans' combination of power and principle. The narrative of a merciless, barbaric enemy crumbled under lived experience. Officers who had once viewed Americans as monsters now saw them as disciplined professionals guided by a coherent moral code. This realization shaped post-war attitudes, influencing Japan's willingness to accept surrender, cooperate with occupation authorities, and eventually rebuild as a nation aligned with global norms of law and human rights. Okinawa, therefore, was more than a military victory. It became a defining moral moment, demonstrating that restraint and discipline could coexist with overwhelming combat power, and that humanity, even in the most brutal of wars, could redefine the enemy's perception, weaken the grip of ideology, and influence the outcome of a nation's surrender. This understanding forms the bridge to the final reflection on what these events meant for history, warfare, and humanity itself. Okinawa stands as one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, yet its significance extends far beyond the toll of lives and shattered terrain. For Japanese officers who survived the island's devastation, it became a revelation, a moment when the enemy they had been taught to hate revealed not cruelty, but a disciplined humanity that defied expectation. The Americans had fought fiercely, yet consistently, with rules, restraint, and an adherence to principles that transcended the immediate desire for revenge. This paradox, immense destructive power paired with moral discipline, offers a timeless lesson about warfare and humanity. In the chaos of battle, when fear, anger, and survival instincts dominate, it would have been far easier to abandon compassion. And yet, U.S. forces repeatedly chose to act otherwise. Medics treated enemies, civilians were safeguarded, and surrendering soldiers were preserved rather than executed. These choices were not born of naivety, but of doctrine, leadership, and a belief that strength is not measured solely by victory, but by the ability to remain humane even in the darkest hours. For Japan, the experience left a profound imprint. Officers who had internalized a rigid code of honor now confronted the reality that the enemy's behavior did not fit their expectations. Hatred, they realized, was neither universal nor inevitable. Humanity could exist alongside relentless combat, and moral choice could shape outcomes as decisively as guns and artillery. In the broader sweep of history, Okinawa and the Pacific campaigns illustrate that war is never only about destruction. It is about decisions, principles, and the character of those who fight. The U.S. example on Okinawa demonstrated that even amidst total war, humanity could survive, influence the enemy, and reshape perceptions in ways that reverberate long after the final shot is fired. In the mud, smoke, and ruin of that island, Japanese officers learned a lesson their education had never prepared them for. The enemy can be fearsome, yet moral, relentless, yet humane. And in that revelation lies the enduring truth of Okinawa, that even in the darkest theaters of war, humanity can prevail.